And how this is all being framed domestically in China, and sort of how it came about, because it was thrust upon us relatively short notice. And if the Foreign Secretary is being tough, as he seemed to allude to when you spoke to him earlier, is he being welcomed by the national media in China for arriving there, or criticised?
Well, look, I think the welcoming sentiments from Han Zhong, who's the Vice President of China, was reasonably cordial, actually. Han Zhong actually was in the UK relatively recently. He was the representative that China sent to the coronation of King Charles. It's actually important to emphasise, though, that in the sort of pecking order, if you like, of foreign dignitaries, foreign leaders, foreign secretaries who have been through Beijing in recent months, the UK is relatively low down that pecking order. Certainly not the same fanfare that we've seen for, say, the Americans or the French or the Germans. And I think that's relatively telling. But look, James Cleverly comes here walking a very, very fine line. It's been 5 years since the last Foreign Secretary was here, and this place has changed enormously in that time, and the UK's relationship with it has changed enormously in that time. You know, in that 5 years, we have seen brutal human rights crackdowns in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We've seen China sort of a thinly veiled support for Putin's war in Ukraine. We've seen increased threats against Taiwan. There's been increased suppression of ordinary people, their rights to free speech, journalists, lawyers, civil society, the list goes on. So it is a very, very different place. And while James Cleverly was very keen to emphasise that engagement is totally crucial with the world's second largest economy. We do enormous amounts of trade with China, and we need their cooperation, he says, on issues like climate change and global economic security. He did say that he would be raising those thornier issues, human rights, Ukraine, the sanctioning of certain UK MPs. We had a pretty heated exchange, he and I, about how far he was willing to push on that, because I think it's become pretty obvious in recent years here in China that words in meetings are relatively unlikely to move the dial on some of those central Chinese policies. But look, I think he also comes here under a bit of a veil of criticism from back at home, not least from hawks within his own party who'd like to see a much harder line on China, but from more broad quarters as well. There was an absolutely scathing report from the Intelligence and Security Committee just last month that described UK government policy towards China as inadequate and inconsistent. There was a report from the Foreign Affairs Committee last night that also said that the approach has been relatively inconsistent. There's been lots of warnings from spy agencies about it. And the accusation is that while China plans, years and decades in advance and is very strategic, the UK, on the other hand, has done a lot of flip-flopping in recent years, high-profile disagreements on even what we should call China. Is it a threat? Is it a challenge? Is it a hostile state? So I think those accusations of inconsistency and short-termism really follow him here. I think he's here to seek a bit of a reset after all of that I've just described. But look, diplomacy with China is a deeply complex thing, and I think the Foreign Office has been quite open about the fact they aren't expecting any major breakthroughs this time.